The heat on Sunday, December 17th, 1967, was oppressive. A suffocating blanket that settled heavy over the Mornington Peninsula. It was the kind of Australian summer day that feels less like a season and more like a physical weight, pressing down on the scorched earth and the shimmering asphalt. For Harold Holt, the 59-year-old Prime Minister of Australia, the ocean was not just a scenic backdrop. It was a necessity, a place of refuge where the crushing burdens of statecraft, the growing unpopularity of the Vietnam War, and the internecine squabbles of his coalition government could be washed away by the cold, violent embrace of the Bass Strait. Holt was a man who prided himself on his vitality. He crafted an image of the sportsman, the spear fisherman, the lover of life who refused to be tethered by the stuffy protocols of his office. Yet on this particular morning, there were cracks in the facade. He was taking painkillers for a shoulder injury, a nagging reminder of mortality that did not pair well with the treacherous currents he so loved. His doctor had advised him to take it easy, to rest. But Holt was possessed by a restless energy. He needed the water. He had driven his maroon Pontiac Parisienne down to Portsea earlier that weekend, seeking the sanctuary of his holiday home. By late morning on Sunday, the plan was simple and seemingly innocuous. A drive to the tip of the peninsula to watch the arrival of the British yachtsman Alec Rose, who was circumnavigating the globe. Accompanying Holt were his neighbor and rumored lover, Marjorie Gillespie, her daughter Viner Wilson, Viner's boyfriend Martin Simpson, and a family friend named Alan Stewart. It was an intimate circle, a casual gathering of friends looking to escape the heat, unaware that they were about to become the sole witnesses to a baffling historical tragedy. They drove past the guarded gates of the Point Nepean Quarantine Station, a restricted military area where Holt, by virtue of his office and his local influence, had special permission to roam. The destination was Cheviot Beach. Even among locals, Cheviot has a reputation. It is a wild, unkempt stretch of coast where the Southern Ocean slams into the continent with untamed ferocity. The beach is not a place for leisurely wading. It is a place of sharp sandstone reefs, deep channels, and rips that can drag a swimmer out to sea with the speed of a sprinting man. When the group arrived at the dunes overlooking the beach, the conditions were far from welcoming. The tide was exceptionally high, swollen by the alignment of the moon and the sheer force of the swell. The water was a churning mess of gray and green, kicking up sand and foam in a chaotic rhythm. Most prudent swimmers would have looked at the whitecaps and remained on the sand. But Holt was not in a prudent mood. He was looking at the water with a sense of familiarity that bordered on arrogance. He had swum here hundreds of times. He knew the reefs. He knew the holes. He believed he knew the ocean better than than it knew itself. As they descended the wooden steps to the sand, the wind whipped around them, carrying the roar of the surf. It was roughly 11:30 in the morning. The group set their towels down, but Holt did not linger. He began to undress behind a rocky outcrop, changing into his swimming trunks. There was a casualness to his movements that in hindsight feels chilling. He moved with the ease of a man performing a routine he expected to repeat 1,000 times more. Marjorie Gillespie watched him with a mixture of affection and concern. She knew the water was rough. She later recounted that the surf was higher than she had ever seen it, creating a turbulence that made the usual swimming spots unrecognizable. When Holt emerged, ready for the water, he looked at the violent waves and reportedly said, "I know this beach like the back of my hand." It was a statement of ownership, a claim of dominance over the elements that the ocean was about to challenge. Holt walked toward the water's edge. Alan Stewart, perhaps sensing the danger, went in with him, but stayed shallow, merely wetting his knees. The water was cold, a shock to the system against the humid air. Holt plunged in. He did not hesitate. He began to swim straight out, moving away from the shore with a steady, rhythmic stroke. The others on the beach watched him go. At first, it seemed like a typical display of his prowess. He swam past the first line of breakers, heading for deeper water. But the ocean that day was not behaving according to the rules Holt thought he knew. The tide was pulling with immense force, creating a drag that was invisible from the surface, but lethal underneath. Witnesses later described the water around Holt as boiling. It was an eerie detail that suggests the collision of opposing currents, a chaotic vortex of water that was churning around the Prime Minister. Marjorie Gillespie stood at the water's edge, her eyes fixed on the bobbing head of the man she loved. She saw him move further out, past the safety of the shallow reefs. He wasn't swimming back. He wasn't turning parallel to the beach. He was drifting. The realization that something was wrong did not hit everyone at once. It came in waves, much like the tide. First, there was confusion. Why was he going so far out? Then a creeping anxiety. Why wasn't he turning around? Martin Simpson, watching from the sand, noticed that the drift was rapid. One moment Holt was within a salvageable distance. The next, he was 100 yards out, a small dark speck against the immense, heaving canvas of the Bass Strait. What remains most haunting about these few minutes is the silence. There was no shouting. Holt did not raise his arm in distress. He did not scream for help. He did not thrash wildly in the panic of a drowning man. To the witnesses on the shore, it appeared as though he was simply swimming away, or perhaps that he was already engaged in a struggle so all-consuming that he had no breath left to call out. He was fighting a silent battle against a volume of water that rendered his political power, his wealth, and his physical strength utterly meaningless. Alan Stewart, realizing the gravity of the situation, scrambled up the dunes to the observation tower, hoping to find binoculars or summon help. But the distance was already too great. Marjorie Gillespie continued to watch, paralyzed by the unfolding nightmare. She saw his head visible above a cresting wave. Then he dropped into the trough behind it. She waited for him to reappear on the next swell. He did not. One moment, the Prime Minister of Australia was there, a living, breathing man fighting the current. The next moment, there was only the ocean. The green water rolled on, indifferent and unbroken. A piece of driftwood, or perhaps kelp, bobbed in the distance, momentarily tricking the eye. But Harold Holt was gone. It happened with a terrifying speed and a lack of ceremony that shocked the mind. There was no crescendo, no final dramatic gesture, just a sudden, absolute absence. The panic that followed was frantic and disorganized. Stewart drove the car back to the quarantine station at breakneck speed to raise the alarm. The others remained on the beach, scanning the water with desperate intensity, hoping that perhaps he had just ducked under, that he was playing a prank, or that he had managed to swim to a rocky outcrop further down the coast. But the minutes stretched into 10, then 20. The ocean offered nothing back. By the time the first police officers and search and rescue teams arrived, the reality of the situation was setting in, heavy and cold. The most powerful man in the country had vanished into the surf of a restricted beach, leaving behind his pile of clothes, his sandals, and a nation that would never be the same. The search that was about to commence would be the largest in Australian history, involving the Navy, the Air Force, police divers, and hundreds of volunteers. They would scour the seabed, the cliffs, and the surrounding bushland. But in those initial hours, as the news began to filter up the chain of command, triggering contingency plans and political chaos, the scene at Cheviot Beach remained strangely intimate and horrific. The sun was still beating down. The flies were still buzzing in the sticky heat. The waves continued to crash against the sandstone with a rhythmic, deafening roar, guarding their secret. The incident was over. The mystery had begun. The water had taken Harold Holt, and it gave every indication that it had no intention of giving him back. The atmosphere on the beach shifted from a lazy Sunday excursion to a crime scene of nature. The footprints Holt had left in the sand were still fresh, leading down to the water's edge, marking the last physical contact a head of state had with his country. The paradox was absolute. He was the leader of a nation, surrounded by security protocols and the machinery of government. Yet he died, or disappeared, entirely alone, isolated in a tumult of white water, watched by a helpless few who could do nothing but witness the impossible. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows lengthened across the dunes, the hopelessness of the situation became palpable. The sea conditions worsened, making immediate rescue attempts by divers nearly suicidal. The very turbulence that had likely claimed him now protected him from discovery. It was as if the ocean had closed a door. The incident at Cheviot Beach was not just a drowning. It was a vanishing act so complete that it felt less like a biological event and more like a metaphysical rupture. Harold Holt had walked into the water and dissolved, leaving behind a silence that still echoes through the corridors of Australian history. The ocean has a way of keeping its secrets, burying them under tons of crushing pressure and shifting sands. But the disappearance of Harold Holt is not merely a story about a man lost to the sea. It is a narrative riddled with jagged edges, a puzzle where the pieces do not quite fit together, no matter how hard history tries to sand them down. When a standing head of state vanishes into thin air, or rather, into thick, churning foam, without leaving a trace, the human mind struggles to accept the simplicity of an accident. We look for patterns in the noise. We look for the anomalies. And in the case of the Australian Prime Minister, the anomalies are as deep and treacherous as the rip currents at Cheviot Beach. To understand the unsettling nature of this case, one must first look at the environment of security, or the complete lack thereof, which stands as the first glaring irregularity. It is almost impossible to conceive in the modern era, where world leaders move within hermetically sealed bubbles of armored convoys and earpiece-wearing agents, that a prime minister could essentially wander off the map. On that Sunday morning of December 17th, 1967, Harold Holt was not surrounded by a phalanx of security. He was arguably the most powerful man in the country, yet he arrived at a dangerous, unpatrolled beach with nothing more than a few friends and a lover. There were no bodyguards scanning the horizon. There were no divers in the water. The relaxed Australian attitude of the 1960s is often cited as the reason for this informality. But even by the standards of the day, the solitude of his swim feels negligent to the point of absurdity. This was a man with access to the deepest state secrets, a man navigating the complexities of the Vietnam War and the Cold War, floating alone in volatile waters. Then there is the matter of the water itself and Holt's physical condition, a juxtaposition that creates friction in the official narrative. Harold Holt was not a feeble man. He was 59 years old, a fitness enthusiast, a spear fisherman, and a strong swimmer who prided himself on his endurance. He knew Cheviot Beach. He knew its temperament. Yet, on this specific day, the conditions were described by witnesses as exceptionally violent. The tide was high, creating a turbulence that local sailors knew to avoid. One witness described the water as looking like boiling milk, a chaotic churn of foam and sand. Why would a man who respected the ocean, who understood the mechanics of tides and currents, choose to enter such obviously lethal surf? It contradicts the profile of an experienced diver. It suggests either a colossal lapse in judgment, a desire to impress his company, or a mind so preoccupied with other burdens that the physical danger barely registered. The behavior of the witnesses adds another layer of grim confusion to the timeline. Holt was accompanied by Marjorie Gillespie, her daughter Viner, and two young men, Martin Simpson and Alan Stewart. As Holt swam further out, moving away from the safety of the shore with a steady, determined stroke, the group on the beach watched him. They did not immediately panic. They did not scream for him to return. According to the statements given to the police, they simply watched the head of the government drift further into the boiling milk until the ocean swallowed him. There is a strange passivity in the accounts of those final minutes, a disconnect between the urgency of the danger and the reaction of the observers. Marjorie Gillespie later described seeing the water around him become turbulent, and then, suddenly, there was nothing. No waving arm, no cry for help, just a silence where a man used to be. The quietness of his departure stands in stark contrast to the violence of the sea, creating a surreal gap in the story that feels scripted, or perhaps edited. However, the most profound anomaly, the one that fuels the fires of conspiracy to this day, is the total absence of physical remains. The search operation launched in the wake of the disappearance was the largest in Australian maritime history. Hundreds of personnel, including police, Navy divers, Air Force helicopters, and Army contingents, scoured the coastline. They combed the beaches, probed the rock pools, and dove into the murk until they were exhausted. They found nothing. Not a swimming trunk, not a snorkel, not a fragment of bone. The ocean at Portsea is wild, certainly, and it is known for its kelp forests and sharks. But it is rare for the sea to take a body and never give back a single clue. Usually, currents deposit debris. Usually, nature offers a grim return. The absolute sterility of the search results is what allowed the void to be filled with wilder theories. If the body is not there, the mind asks, then where is it? This absence birthed the most bizarre and persistent anomaly of all, the Chinese submarine theory. Years after the disappearance, a British journalist named Anthony Gray published a book claiming that Holt had not drowned, but had been a sleeper agent for the People's Republic of China. The theory posited that Holt swam out to a waiting submarine, boarded it, and defected to Beijing. On the surface, The idea seems like the pulp fiction of a fevered imagination. It sounds ludicrous, yet it gained traction not because of hard evidence, but because the official story of a simple drowning felt insufficient to explain the total vanishing. The submarine theory, no matter how improbable, offered a solution to the missing body. It turned a tragedy into a spy thriller, while widely discredited and lacking any corroborating proof from intelligence agencies. The very existence of such a theory highlights the deep psychological unsettledness of the public. People preferred to believe their prime minister was a super spy, rather than accept he was simply erased by a wave. There were also darker, more political anomalies swirling in the background, involving the Central Intelligence Agency and the geopolitical chessboard of the Cold War. In 1967, Australia was a crucial pivot point in the Vietnam War. Holt was a staunch ally of the United States, famously declaring he was all the way with LBJ, referring to President Lyndon B. Johnson. However, there were whispers, unverified but persistent, that Holt was growing disillusioned with the war, that he was considering pulling Australian troops out. In the paranoid atmosphere of the era, this political drift was dangerous. Some theorists suggest that Holt was not removed by nature, but by design. They point to the lack of security as a convenient gap left open for an assassination. While there is no document, no declassified order that supports this, the timing of his disappearance, occurring just as internal and external pressures were reaching a boiling point, remains a suspicious coincidence to those who view history through the lens of power and leverage. Even the inquests carry an air of incompleteness. The law requires certainty, but the death of Harold Holt offers only probability. It took decades for the coroner to officially rule the death as an accidental drowning, a ruling made in the early 2000s. For nearly 40 years, the case sat in a legal limbo, a death without a corpse, a funeral without a casket. This bureaucratic hesitation speaks volumes. It suggests that even the authorities were paralyzed by the lack of concrete evidence. They knew that declaring him dead was a formality. Yet the lack of closure gnawed at the procedural machinery of the state. We are left, then, with a tapestry woven from missing threads. We have a prime minister swimming alone in dangerous waters. We have witnesses who watched him vanish without a sound. We have a massive search that recovered nothing. And we have a geopolitical climate thick with espionage and paranoia. When you stack these anomalies one atop the other, the picture that emerges is not necessarily one of conspiracy, but of a terrifying randomness. The idea that a world leader can be extinguished so easily, so casually, by a shift in the tide is a horror all its own. Perhaps the true anomaly is not a submarine or an assassin, but the fragility of power itself. We build structures, governments, and hierarchies to create a sense of order and permanence. We surround our leaders with protocols and protections. But at Cheviot Beach, on a hot Sunday in December, the chaos of the natural world collided with the order of the political world, and the natural world won decisively. The ocean does not care about election results or foreign policy. It does not recognize status. As we look back at the disappearance of Harold Holt, we must navigate these irregularities with a skeptical eye. We must acknowledge that while the most likely explanation is a tragic drowning, the circumstances surrounding it were so uniquely flawed, so perfectly aligned for disaster, that they invite doubt. The story remains unsettled because the ocean is a dynamic, living thing that changes every second, while the mystery of Harold Holt is frozen in time, a permanent question mark etched into the history of a nation. The sandshoes were never found. The body was never recovered. And so, the anomalies remain, drifting just beneath the surface, waiting for a tide that will never come in. The ocean has a way of swallowing sound just as easily as it swallows light. After the frenzy of the initial search faded, after the helicopters grounded their rotors, and the Navy divers dried their gear, a heavy silence settled over Cheviot Beach. This was the beginning of the long, frustrating chapter of the Harold Holt mystery that investigators call the dead ends. It is the phase where the adrenaline of the rescue mission curdled into the ink of police reports and the whispers of conspiracy theorists. When a prime minister vanishes into the surf, the human mind struggles to accept the simplicity of accidental drowning. We crave a narrative with a villain, a plot twist, or a hidden door. But in the weeks, months, and years following that December afternoon in 1967, every door that opened revealed only an empty room. The first dead end was the search itself. It remains one of the largest search and rescue operations in the history of the Australian Commonwealth. Over 300 people scoured the coastline. They used helicopters, boats, and shoreline patrols. Police divers braved the churning washing machine of the Bass Strait, dodging sharp rocks and navigating thick forests of kelp that could ensnare a man as effectively as a net. They found nothing. No swimsuit, no body, no trace. The report filed by the Commonwealth and Victoria Police was clinically precise in its failure. It detailed tides, currents, and visibility, but it could not produce the one thing that would silence the questions. Without a body, the case was technically a missing persons file, a bureaucratic limbo that allowed the imagination of the public to run wild. In the vacuum of hard evidence, the official conclusion of accidental drowning felt unsatisfactory to a shocked nation. How could a strong swimmer, a man who knew this beach intimately, simply dissolve. This disbelief led investigators down the murky path of Harold Holt's physical and mental state. This was the second dead end, the theory of suicide. Proponents of the suicide theory pointed to the pressures of the office. 1967 had been a difficult year for the coalition government. There were whispers of dissent within the party, and the shadow of the Vietnam War was lengthening. Holt was taking painkillers for a recurring shoulder injury, and some speculated this led to a clouded mind or a depressive episode. They painted a picture of a man walking into the sea to escape the burdens of state. However, when investigators dug into the final days of Harold Holt, the suicide narrative fell apart. Witnesses described his demeanor as buoyant. He had been joking with his family and guests just hours before the swim. Marjorie Gillespie, the woman he was with on the beach, insisted there was no melancholy in his actions. He had planned his schedule for the following week. He had ordered suits from his tailor. He was looking forward to the future. The suicide theory required a secret, internal collapse that left no external debris, and the people closest to him simply did not see it. The image of a depressed leader walking stoically into the waves was a dramatic literary device, not a reflection of the man who had engaged in a playful race to the water. If he did not die by his own hand, and if the ocean refused to yield his body to prove an accident, then the door was open for the truly bizarre. This leads us to the most famous and fantastic dead end of all, the Chinese submarine. It sounds like the plot of a paperback thriller found in an airport spinning rack. But for a time, serious people debated the possibility that Harold Holt was a sleeper agent for the People's Republic of China. The theory, popularized years later in a controversial book, posited that Holt had not drowned at all. Instead, he had swum out to a prearranged rendezvous point where Chinese frogmen dragged him aboard a waiting submarine to defect to Beijing. Investigators and naval experts tore this theory to shreds, but not before it had embedded itself in the Australian cultural psyche. The logistics alone made it impossible. Cheviot Beach is a jagged, treacherous stretch of water. It is shallow, filled with reefs, and pounded by the unpredictable surf of the Bass Strait. A submarine trying to navigate those waters would have been dashed against the rocks or grounded within minutes. Furthermore, the idea that a prime minister could swim out to a vessel unseen while his friends watched from the dunes defied the laws of physics and optics. Marjorie Gillespie was watching him. She saw the water become turbulent around him. She saw him drift further out. She did not see a periscope or a team of frogmen. She saw a man becoming a speck in a vast, angry ocean. Yet the submarine theory persists as a dead end because it speaks to the paranoia of the era. It was the height of the Cold War, Spies were real. Defections happened. The idea that the Prime Minister was a communist spy was a seductive explanation because it gave meaning to the meaningless. It transformed a tragedy into a grand game of geopolitical chess. But like the suicide theory, it hit the wall of reality. There was no submarine. There was no life in Beijing. There was only the empty sea. Another avenue of investigation, darker and more cynical, explored the possibility of assassination. This theory suggested that Holt was removed, perhaps by the American Central Intelligence Agency, because he intended to pull Australia out of the Vietnam War. This was the era of political assassinations. Kennedy was fresh in the world's memory. The timeline, however, proved to be another dead end. Holt was a staunch ally of the United States. He was the man who had famously declared that Australia was all the way with LBJ, while he had privately expressed concerns about the conduct of the war. There was no evidence suggesting a radical shift in policy that would warrant a foreign intelligence agency executing a head of state in the surf. Moreover, the method was absurd. If an agency wanted to assassinate a world leader, drowning him in rough surf in front of witnesses was a plan fraught with failure points. A bullet, a poison, or a staged car accident would have been infinitely more reliable. The CIA theory relied on the premise that Holt was a threat to the American war machine, a premise that historians have largely rejected. Holt was a loyal, if increasingly weary, partner in the alliance. This path, too, led nowhere. The investigators also had to navigate the delicate and scandalous dead end of Holt's personal life. It was an open secret in Canberra that the Prime Minister had a wandering eye. Marjorie Gillespie was not just a neighbor, she was his lover. Some speculated that Holt had faked his death to run away with a mistress, or perhaps to escape the tangled web of his romantic engagements. This theory posited that he swam around the headland to a waiting boat, not a submarine, but a private vessel that whisked him away to the French Riviera or a remote island. Police looked into reports of Holt sightings all over the world. A man in a bar in Cannes, a figure on a beach in Tahiti. Every lead was chased down. Every lead was a case of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. The financial audit of Holt's affairs showed no hidden stockpiles of cash, no secret bank accounts accessed after his disappearance. He had left his wallet, his clothes, and his life on the sand. To stage such a disappearance would require resources and planning that simply did not exist. He was a man who lived in the public eye, recognized instantly by his face and his voice. The idea that he could vanish and live a second life undetected was a romantic fantasy, a way to deny the finality of death. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to wind down. The coroner's inquiry was eventually held without a body, a rare occurrence. The finding was death by accidental drowning. The report noted that the tide was high and the surf was unusually turbulent. It noted that Holt, despite his bravado, was 59 years old and suffering from a shoulder injury that would have impeded his swimming. It noted that he had taken a risk and the ocean had exacted a price. But the dead ends remain haunting. They represent the collective refusal of a nation to accept that a prime minister could be extinguished so easily. We look at the submarine, the suicide, the spies, and the lovers because looking directly at the water is too terrifying. The water tells us that power, status, and importance mean nothing to a rip current. The ultimate dead end is the biological reality of the ocean. Marine experts explained that the body was likely taken by the undertow, dragged into the deep crevices of the reef, and pinned down by the pressure of the water. Over time, the marine life, the sea lice, the crabs, the sharks would have done their work. It is a gruesome clinical fact that stands in stark contrast to the pomp and circumstance of a state funeral. There was no coffin to lower. There was only a memorial service where the empty space spoke louder than the eulogies. In the end, the file on Harold Holt is a collection of negatives. No body found, no foul play detected, no evidence of espionage, no note left behind. The investigator is left standing on the cliffs of Cheviot Beach, staring at the same gray water that Marjorie Gillespie watched in 1967. The waves crash with a rhythmic indifference. The dead ends are not just failures of investigation. They are the boundaries of our understanding. We have mapped the ocean floor, but we cannot map the silence it leaves behind. The disappearance of Harold Holt remains a story with a beginning, a chaotic middle, and absolutely no end. The only truth that remains is the one the police report concluded, yet the one the public refused to believe. He went into the water, and the water took him. Everything else is just a ghost story we tell ourselves to fill the void. The ocean along the Victorian coast does not negotiate. It is a violent, churning entity, particularly where the rip tides of the Bass Strait collide with the Mornington Peninsula. Standing on the cliffs overlooking Cheviot Beach today, one feels the damp weight of the salt spray and the menacing roar of water crashing against jagged rock. It is a place of raw indifference, and it is here, on a Sunday morning in December 1967, that the history of Australia fractured into a permanent question mark. The disappearance of Prime Minister Harold Holt is not merely a story of a drowning. It is a narrative gap, a void where a conclusion should be. And into that void, decades of speculation, paranoia, and sorrow have poured. To understand the lingering signal of this mystery, one must look past the headlines of the day and stare into the chaotic waters that swallowed a head of State whole. On that fateful afternoon, December 17, the conditions were treacherous. The surf was high, the undertow fierce. Yet Harold Holt, 59 years old, and a man who prided himself on his physical vitality, walked into the surf. He was not a man who feared the water. He was a spearfisherman, a diver, a man who found solace in the silence beneath the waves. But the sea he entered that day was agitated, described by witnesses as boiling with turbulence. What makes the narrative so unsettling is the banality of the moments preceding the vanish. There was no security detail forming a phalanx around him. There were no flashing lights or sirens. It was just a man, his romantic partner Marjorie Gillespie, and a few friends on a beach. Witnesses recall that Holt swam out farther than seemed prudent. He moved away from the shore with a steady stroke, heading toward deeper water where the kelp beds swayed in the dark currents. Marjorie Gillespie watched from the sand. She later testified that the water seemed to swarm around him. One moment, his head was visible above the crest of a wave, a small point of humanity against the vastness of the ocean. The next, the water smoothed over, and he was gone. There was no flailing, no cry for help that reached the shore. It was a silent erasure. The ocean simply took him back. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic frenzy that stands in stark contrast to the quiet disappearance. Within hours, Cheviot Beach became the focal point of the largest search and rescue operation in Australian history. Helicopters sliced through the humid air, their rotors chopping the sound of the surf. Navy divers, police, and Army personnel scoured the coast. They battled visibility that was near zero, navigating through forests of thick kelp that grabbed at their limbs like drowning hands. This is where the factual record begins to blur into the uncanny. Despite the sheer scale of the search, despite the hundreds of eyes scanning every crevice and tide pool, no trace of Harold Holt was ever found. No body, no fragment of swimwear, nothing. The official conclusion was accidental drowning, a verdict that makes logical sense given the conditions. The sea is deep, the currents are strong, and bodies can be pulled miles out into the Bass Strait or trapped beneath ledges, held down by the pressure of the ocean. However, the human mind abhors a vacuum. When a prime minister vanishes without a trace, the official story of a tragic accident often feels insufficient to carry the weight of the event. The silence from the water created a noise in the culture, a signal of distress that mutated into wild theories. The disappearance coincided with the height of the Cold War, a time of deep geopolitical anxiety. Australia was heavily involved in the Vietnam War, and tensions were high. In this atmosphere of paranoia, the idea that the leader of the country simply drowned felt too random, too meaningless. The most enduring, and perhaps the most bizarre, of these theories is the one that suggests Holt was not a victim of the sea, but an agent of it. Years after the event, a British journalist named Anthony Gray published a book claiming that Harold Holt had been a lifelong spy for the Chinese government. The theory posits that Holt did not drown, but swam out to a waiting Chinese submarine stationed off the coast. According to this narrative, he was plucked from the water, whisked away to Beijing, and lived out the rest of his days in exile. While this theory has been roundly debunked by family, friends, and historians, and dismissed as a fabrication by the Chinese government, it persists in the Australian psyche. It persists because it offers a narrative closure that reality denied. It turns a senseless tragedy into a spy thriller. It gives Holt a second life, however implausible, rather than a cold death in the kelp. The image of the submarine periscope breaking the surface of the boiling surf is a powerful hallucination that hangs over the mystery, a phantom signal that refuses to fade. There were darker whispers as well. Some speculated suicide. Holt was reportedly under immense strain. Political infighting, the unpopularity of the war, and health issues were allegedly weighing on him. Witnesses spoke of a man who looked tired, perhaps even haunted, in the weeks leading up to the swim. Did he swim out with the intention of never coming back? Was the ocean a convenient exit strategy for a man cornered by the pressures of office? Marjorie Gillespie staunchly denied this, insisting he was in good spirits, looking forward to the future. Yet the speculation lingers, casting a shadow over his memory. Then there are the theories involving intelligence agencies. The Central Intelligence Agency, always a convenient villain in the narratives of the 1960s, was rumored to be unhappy with Holt's potential wavering on Vietnam. Could he have been removed, assassinated by frogmen in the confusion of the surf? It sounds like fiction, but in the era of Kennedy and shadowy operations, the public imagination was fertile ground for such seeds. But strip away the submarines and the assassins, and you are left with the most unsettling reality of all. The ocean is vast, and we are small. The search for Harold Holt revealed the terrifying power of the natural world. Divers reported that the conditions underwater were nightmarish. The turbulence was so intense that they were thrown against rocks and entangled in weeds. It was a hostile, alien environment. The fact that the Prime Minister could be consumed so utterly by the landscape he governed speaks to a primal vulnerability. The lingering signal of this mystery is not just about what happened to the man, but what his disappearance did to the nation. It shattered the illusion of stability. It proved that the structures of power are fragile, that a single wave can alter the course of history. Australia was left with a memorial that is, ironically, and perhaps fittingly, a swimming pool in Melbourne. The Harold Holt Memorial Swimming Centre stands as a testament to the nation's grim sense of humor and its refusal to let the tragedy become entirely maudlin. Even now, over half a century later, the file remains technically open in the minds of the public. Every few years, a new lead surfaces, or a new documentary rehashes the timeline. We scrutinize the tide charts of 1967. We analyze the testimonies of the witnesses who are now long gone. We look for patterns in the static. Investigative reports from the time show a police force ill-equipped to handle a mystery of this magnitude. The crime scene, if it was a crime scene, was a washing machine of salt water. Evidence was transient. Footprints on the sand were erased by the wind and the tide within minutes. The very environment conspired to keep the secret. There is a profound melancholy in reading the coroner's findings from 2005, released decades after the fact to formally close the case. The coroner found that Holt had drowned in accidental circumstances, taking a necessary risk in rough water. It was a mundane conclusion to a mythological event. It stated that his body was likely ravaged by sea lice and crustaceans, or carried out to the deep ocean. It was a clinical, biological explanation for a spectral event. Yet, standing at Cheviot Beach, looking out at the gray horizon, the coroner's report feels abstract. The sensory reality of the place takes over. The sound of the waves is a constant, rhythmic drumming. One can almost see the figure of the Prime Minister bobbing in the swell, moving further and further away until he dissolves into the grain of the film. The signal lingers because there is no body to bury. Without the physical evidence of death, the mind permits the possibility of survival, however remote. We are wired to seek patterns and causes. We struggle to accept that a world leader can simply vanish due to a cramp or a rogue wave. It feels like a glitch in the simulation, an error in the script of history. So the story of Harold Holt remains suspended in that gray water. It is a mystery comprised of salt, seaweed, and silence. It is a reminder that no matter how much power a man accumulates, he is ultimately organic matter subject to the whims of the tide. The conspiracies, the submarines, the spies, the assassins are merely our attempt to impose order on chaos, to write a plot where there was only an ending. The truth is likely far quieter and far more terrifying. He swam out, and the water closed over him, and the world kept turning, leaving a lingering signal of unease that washes up on the shore with every tide.